George Ruby is an associate professor at the University of Kentucky in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction and is the executive director of the Collaborative Center for Literacy Development for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. He has authored the annual review paper for the newest volume of the British Journal of Educational Psychology, to be published in March 2012. In this article, he examines the intersection between neuroscience and education, a new field called educational neuroscience. George, what is educational neuroscience?
Well, Linda, it's a very exciting hybrid field of educational inquiry that would glean implications from neuroscience for educational practice, research, and theory. The interest here is keen, though over the past 2 decades it has often been rather overexuberant. But the scholarly work that has been done and that has increasingly emerged over the past quarter century is quite sophisticated and I think fairly impressive. We've had educational psychologists trained in cognitive research and in cognitive psychologists with an interest in education who developed the secondary expertise in the neurosciences in order to collaborate competently in neuroscience collaborations. And of course, neuroscience studies are just about always collaborations across numerous specialists in diverse fields, neurocytologists, neuroanatomists, psychobiologists, biomedical technicians, statistical analysts, a small army of graduate students, and so on. And so they've been able to collaborate in these and often take the lead on publications that would, as I say, glean implications for education, at least very formative ones, and also author some pieces for the educational research journals that have been very helpful. We've also had educational scholars in teacher education, content-specific, skills-specific, grade or age level-specific scholars who have also developed a secondary expertise in the neurosciences and ancillary domains in psychology and in philosophy, philosophy of mind or philosophy of biology, neurophilosophy, and have done some fairly impressive literature review-based syntheses and theoretical analyses and critiques. So the body of work here is impressive, and we've more recently begun to see the development of graduate courses and even graduate programs in this area. The Brain Neurosciences and Education Special Interest Group of the American Educational Research Association, which I've been a past president and a program chair of for a few years, has been around since 1986. The Center for Educational Neuroscience in London has been around for several years and is doing great work. The Mind-Brain Education program at Harvard and its journal and its international society has been very active. OECD and the European Association of Research on Learning and Instruction has a keen interest in educational neuroscience. So what we see is an emerging maturity here that is very exciting. And so the question that remains is educational neuroscience still only a formative studies area for adventurous and iconoclastic scholars, or is it ready to become a sincere field of educational inquiry accepted within the broader domain of educational research?
The integration of two such diverse fields creates some challenges. And you mentioned 3 of these challenges and claim that addressing them should be taken as a requirement for the field. So can you say more about these challenges?
Yes. In the annual review essay in the British Journal of Ed Psych, I suggest just 3, and there are possibly others, but the 3 that I think are most important are a dedication to intellectual precision and care in the reasoning by which we glean implications from the research base. Secondly, a commitment to mutually informing and respected bilateral expertise. And then thirdly, an acknowledgement of the ethical and moral obligations of educational research generally, which are a bit more pronounced than in many other fields, and the implications specifically of educational research that would frame itself in a biological idiom, as the neurosciences would do, and also then a vigilance against misuse of this work by marketers or policymakers or ideologues.
So can you say more about intellectual precision?
Yes. In that part of the essay, I focus on categorical boundary chiefly, and the avoidance of category error, such as when conflating categories of phenomena. Different fields define themselves by the phenomena they study. And when you bring fields together, you're bringing different phenomena together, and it has occasionally been the case that people have conflated those phenomena, as when we conflate the mind with the brain, as an example. Another case of categorical conflation is when we conflate categories across a scale, either temporal or spatial scale. So, for instance, when we talk about where in the brain we read, no one would ever talk about the muscles in our back where we play tennis, right? Or where we wouldn't talk about the fact that our teeth had breakfast this morning. The firing of the pistons is not the driving of the car. So while there are areas of the brain that seem to be dedicated to particular sub-processes for reading itself is a much more holistic phenomenon. So you want to avoid that sort of conflation as well. And then finally, there's the categorical confusion that's at the heart of circular reasoning, affirmation of the consequent fallacies, which we're prone to fall afoul of when we employ reverse inference, as we often do in correlational research. And of course, the neurosciences, at least behavioral neurosciences, are about correlates to neural activity, not the neural activity directly, and then we correlate that with the behaviors that are categorized in behavioral and cognitive research. So we have a double danger there of affirmation of the consequent fallacy. So precision in our reasoning and definitions is really crucial, and it's crucial for the integrity of our work. It's crucial for how we're perceived by more mature fields of educational research, and I think it's also crucial as something to offer practitioners. Factoids about the brain may not be anywhere near as important for teachers and special educators and other educational professionals as would be attention to precise definitions and care in logical warrants in our reasoning. It's very, there's the potential for misappropriation of our work by well-meaning but inadequately informed practitioners or teacher educators, and if a teacher doesn't have precise definitions with which to engage in formative assessment, it's unlikely they're going to have well-targeted instructional direction as a result. Specialists who use fuzzy definitions to inform the diagnoses are going to wind up with fuzzy diagnoses, and then it's not likely they'll have well-focused interventions. So this sort of precision is important in practice as well as in research, and I think it's important that we exemplify that and make it clear why it's important and how you accomplish that. I think that would be a great service to educational research more generally.
In my own field, dyslexia and learning disabilities in general, I've been appalled by the lack of definitional precision and how difficult this makes it to compare across studies, to evaluate interventions, and then to convey to the general public, teachers or what parents, whatever, what actually it is.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And this issue is also, there are very few meta-analyses in cognitive neuroscience relating to reading. I think there are two, and they're very limited. And the reason is, it's partly because, to be fair, it's partly because the technologies that are employed are so diverse and changing so rapidly, just the way the technologies we have in our laptops or cell phones are changing so rapidly. And so staying on top of those changes many a neuroscience research study will be as much about how to effectively use the technology and methodology as it is the actual object of the inquiry. But there's also the issue of defining and the limiting phenomena for study. When you're correlating categories like that, you can't do a meta-analysis if that's not if they don't match, if it's not precise, and then you just make things worse when you go from neuroscience into cognitive psych, and then from cognitive psych into ed psych, and then from ed psych into practice. So it's important. I think you're quite right that we be precise there. And anything human beings can do, you give them the opportunity, they can do kind of loosely and not well. And it's important that we be doubly careful because if you look at the research in education and you look at the research in neuroscience and the research in psychology, it's kind of the same thing. We have some brilliant landmark work, some groundbreaking work in these fields. And we have a much larger body of more journeyman kind of stuff that contribute more modestly, but nonetheless positively to our knowledge base. And then there's some stuff that's just train wreck of poor reasoning, and that stuff kind of gets lost historically, which is perhaps unfortunate. It'd be nice to have an anthology of bad reasoning studies so that we could use it as cautionary tales. But you could understand why that no one would produce such a thing. But still. And so I think it's important that we exemplify that kind of precision and intellectual coherence in our own work, and make it a point of pride and sort of role model the importance and need for that in educational practice.
I think those are very important points, and I'd like to address another issue, and that is your concept of bilateral expertise. Can you explain that a bit?
By that I mean that obviously we expect educational researchers to have developed both a deep and broad expertise in education. We expect them to have a broad expertise of educational research generally, and a deep expertise in a particular study area. If educational scholars are going to participate in neuroscience collaborations, they of course then also need to develop a secondary expertise in the neurosciences, both broad, so they understand the foundations, the methodologies, the history of research and the issues in that discipline, as well as a depth of understanding in particular studies, the larger corpus of studies in the area that they want to collaborate in, so that they can so they can competently read and evaluate neuroscience studies without a great deal of intellectual trauma, and can actually collaborate in an informed fashion. Now, that doesn't make them neuroscientists, but they need to have that secondary expertise in order to collaborate. And when you look at what we've had to date, we've had some very strong collaborations that extend insights from the neurosciences into psychology, including fields of psychology that have a keen interest in education. But that often doesn't carry forth from, say, the doorstep of ed psych on into teacher education and educational practice and research and theory on the same. On the other hand, we've had a lot of folks who are knowledgeable about education, very keen interest in neuroscience, but they haven't always done their homework and have made a lot of broad and over-exuberant and sweeping claims without any reference to the research itself. And that's not adequate either. So we need to have a bilateral flow of information and respect for the expertise of others. It's too easy to dismiss that with which we are unfamiliar as not being of much value. After all, if it were of any value, we'd know about it, be concerned with it, right? That's kind of a bias that we have to manage our overwhelming at times information flow, and we have to guard against that when we're going to engage in interdisciplinary collaborations, such as educational neuroscience.
I think that's very helpful. Thank you. Now, in addition, you make reference to what you call the ethical and moral implications and obligations of educational neuroscience. So, can you expand about that and tell us, what do you mean by moral obligations, and how does this actually work in practice?
Well, there are the ethical and moral obligations of educational research that are held more generally, albeit variably. The first and obvious one being the welfare of children. Educational researchers, theorists, and scholars are largely people who have a great deal of close experience with the education of children, and they do their research very often in schools and classrooms. This isn't always the case with educational psychologists, and very rarely the case of cognitive psychologists, although some do or have. And they just can't think about children as if they are hypothetical data points in a subject set. There is a moral obligation beyond what the typical IRB approval would require, to realize that we're dealing with human beings in the making, and not to mention legally they're minors, but they're human beings, and so there's a particular concern for their welfare that must be considered. It's also the case that when you do research on instructional practices in schooling, you're talking about institutions of socialization that society operates in order to create the sort of people that we think we want to be sort of society that we want to be. And central to that are, of course, a set of ethical and moral assumptions about what we ought to be. And many critical scholars would look at those institutions of education and socialization and observe that, well, there are a lot of measurable inequities in our society, and they can be parsed as injustices. And when we look to the schools, we would hope to see that they are, to some extent, hopefully ameliorated there. But in fact, we see that they may indeed be constructed and instituted there. And so that's a concern that turning a blind eye to those concerns doesn't mean that you're not implicated in what is going on. There's also the concern for unintentionally or inadvertently inspiring malpractice among practitioners by allowing work to be misappropriated and misapplied too hastily, without adequate and comprehensive review of the broader literature, too quickly on behalf of agendas that you might even buy into. But research and its mindful professional application is a collaborative endeavor. And so there are a lot of implications. There are particularly implications, moral and ethical, relating to any kind of neuroscience that would frame itself biologically. And of course, the value of educational neuroscience is that it not only connects us with the biological processes of the nervous and endocrine system, but that it provides us a window on the developmental sciences more broadly, which are very situated in a bioecological understanding of developmental process. And I think that's a potentially strong positive. But historically, that biology has often been misappropriated and used to justify inequities on the basis of gender or race or class as natural. Being genetically determinate, for instance, is a very worrisome kind of concern. I'd like to think that that's something from the 19th century or the Nazis of the 20th century. But in fact, Charles Murray is out with a brand new book this year, talking about how the devolution of the middle class is due to genetics, because the best and the brightest only allow each other themselves into the elite institutions, meet their spouses there, and then interbreed. And so the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer is supposedly a genetically based and natural phenomenon, and there's nothing we can do about it. This kind of stuff drives me nuts, and it riles most educational researchers as well. So regardless of the position you might take on that, you need to recognize that if you're going to participate within educational research generally and be respected as a field of educational inquiry, that there are certain sensitivities that have to at least be acknowledged and negotiated.
I think those are very important points. And there is one related issue, and that's the issue of interventions that are proposed in the name of brain-based education. So could you expand on how educational neuroscience relates to brain-based education?
Well, hopefully it's a much-needed corrective to brain-based education. Brain-based education got going in the 1990s. And for listeners who are not familiar with the exponential growth of the neurosciences in terms of the number of studies, the number of graduate students pouring into it, the amount of funding that's going into it, and the findings that are being generated by it. What the sort of a double-barreled starting gun here. The first are the psychopharmacological interventions of the 1980s, things like Prozac and Ritalin that could arguably address hitherto very difficult to treat psychological difficulties such as depression or obsessive compulsive disorder or hyperactivity attention disorder and that sort of thing. And then in the late 80s, electroencephalographic and magnetoelectroencephalographic imaging technology allowed researchers to look at electromagnetic field fluctuations of the scalp, presumably correlating with neural activity in the brain, and chart that out on rainbow-colored brain maps. And then in the early 90s, we had positron emission tomography and functional magnetic resonance imaging, which allowed for deep mapping of vascular correlates to neural activity, glucose uptake, oxygen uptake, and that sort of thing. And the public became very excited about this. And of course, the media often misrepresented these brain images as photographs of brains in action, when in fact they're statistical charts based on average subject set data that had gone through a whole lot of statistical cleansing and focusing. Not to call the results into question, but only to say that it was very formative. And I stress that this work gets going in the early 90s. So it's only been 20 years, and the technology has expanded immensely. Well, by the mid-90s, in the so-called decade of the brain, you had people arguing for what they call brain-based education. And these were people who may or may not be knowledgeable about teaching and learning in classrooms, but they certainly didn't make much of an effort to access the research in neuroscience. And they made lots of sweeping claims about the brain, simple, banal claims often of the sort of stuff you could get out of an 8th grade science textbook from 20 years ago, and tried to loosely connect that with a very crude caricature of cognitive mental process. And then before you know it, they're off and running, making recommendations for educational nostrums that have been around for generations and have never been known to be particularly effective when researched, but seem to come back periodically like cicadas and captivate people's imaginations. So the brain-based education is really more of a caricature of popular interest in brain science for informing education, and it sells. It's a great marketing ploy, and that suggests that there's a keen interest here. But what's lacking is the intellectual precision, the expertise, necessary expertise, let alone, well, there's some moral and ethical obligations. For instance, some of the great insights from brain-based education is to remind you not to stress out your students, make sure they're well rested and well fed. You know, I don't think it's ever been recommended that anyone allow children to starve and stay up for 48 hours at a time before taking a test. You know, I mean, no one's ever recommended that kind of abusive behavior. Telling people they should make their instruction more interesting is, yeah, okay, that's great. How do you do that? Brain-based education would fall short of actually providing that sort of information. Meanwhile, promulgating a lot of neuromyths. You know, some people are left-brained, some people are right-brained. This is a nonsensical typology. We use both sides of our brain. You only use 10% of your brain, which shows how much potential you've got left. Oh, come on. We use all of our brain all the time. And so a lot of this stuff is, I mean, some of the stuff's better than others, but by and large, it's just a marketing ploy. So one of the roles for educational neuroscience is to correct that and show how to do it right, because the interest is there, and that's important. And it's there for good reasons, by the way. If you look at brain-based education, for instance, something that a lot of people are tapping pseudo-neuro idioms to support is learning styles, and that's gone by a number of terms over the decades. Sensory modalities, Myers-Briggs personality traits, multiple intelligences, multimodalities, and this sort of thing. And we've done a lot of research on the different grade levels and different content areas. We've done meta-analyses. I think there are even a couple of randomized field trials. And the result is that it has no effect on student achievement. And that's pretty emphatic. So why do we waste our time, and why are teachers so fascinated with this? And I think the answer is that they every day they confront in their classrooms and in their schools immense human variance. On anything you want to measure human beings, they vary. And not only do they vary from one child to another, they vary within a child over time. And the nature of their developmental trajectories vary. And it's important, if you're going to parse this on behalf of probabilities, that you do it carefully and not through pop psych or parlor game typologies. So I think that and to be fair to the teachers, there's a lot of pressure on them right now in a high stakes environment where standards and standardized assessments and standardized curricula on behalf of benchmarks that all students are supposed to make. I know we have this going on in the United States right now. And then penalizing schools, and indeed we're going to be penalizing teachers if they fail to get all of their students up to a particular benchmark level. The problem with the policymakers is that they mistake schools as industrial production facilities, and they think too much of students as industrial products. So any kind of variance is too quickly seen as an industrial production flaw. And, anytime you look at biological kinds, and neuroscience and developmental science more broadly would parse human beings first and foremost as biological kinds, you're going to find variance. It's ubiquitous, and it is necessary for biological systems to function. This is what the philosopher Daniel Dennett calls the universal algorithm, the way in which biological systems proceed and adapt on the basis of replication of structure with variation, allowing for adaptive selection on behalf of functionality in the face of ever-changing and unpredictable environmental contingency. And that's not just the basis for Darwin's theory of natural selection, it's the basis for how the autoimmune system functions. It's the basis for synaptogenesis. It's the basis for neuroblast migration and uptake and regulation of neurotransmitter levels and much more. So it's how the brain operates and develops. I'm not saying this should be used as an idiom to excuse a variance that is suboptimal and that we want to improve. We need to bring all students up as far as we can, but we have to start where they are. And our instruction has to be differentiated and be developmentally appropriate. And teachers know this. So that's why they're attracted to things like learning styles, even though it hasn't demonstrated much value in terms of student achievement. And I think that, as sort of a subtext to a biological turn in educational theory and research for practice is that we could understand these things in a more nuanced and a naturalistic fashion that could be more helpful for our students' learning and development.
There are interventions that call themselves brain-based and imply that before this, nobody ever recognized that the brain had anything to do with learning or even tried to change it. And I am tempted to say to them, where do you think learning takes place? Where do you think people thought learning took place? In the elbow or the big toe?
Linda, it's so much better. This brain-based education is so much better than the old liver-based education we used to have.
That's right.
Of course, it takes place in the brain. But the question then is, so what? In the 1990s, at least in the U.S., there was something that often goes by the name of the sociocultural turn, or the sociolinguistic turn in education, where educational researchers, theorists, teacher educators, and practitioners had sort of become calloused to the claims and debates particularly in cognitive psych-informed education. And what they wanted to do was get learning out of the heads of the learner and into the classroom where the teacher actually has some control over it. And so it was a very important theoretical shift. And there are a lot of positives there, but I think there's some negatives. As a result, you can find some teacher education programs that have no ed psych requirement whatsoever, or the ed psych gets taught by methods instructors integrated in the curriculum that way, who may have a variable mastery of that work, or just ignore it altogether. And so the fact that the brain-based education is so devoid of a sophisticated understanding of psychological learning processes, in part a result of that. or at least is taking advantage of that blind spot that has emerged. And again, I think that the value of educational neuroscience and its window into the developmental sciences is that it supports a bioecological view. It's not a case of in the head or outside of the head. It's not a case of brain structure being responsible for behavioral function or social function being responsible for our structures. It's a case of structure and function being co-causative over time on behalf of adaptive response to unpredictable contingency. Again, it's this. And I think this concept of non-intelligent design might be useful, and situated cognition as well, which is a nice neurological idiom, because most of the craft that effective teachers have is difficult for them to explicate or even to transfer into different kinds of schools or different grade levels. Teachers who've ever had to do that are always astonished by things that have always worked for years when they taught second grade suddenly fall on their face when they go to fourth grade or when they go to the school across town. A lot of our knowledge is not actually represented in any kind of mental structure. It's simply a consistency to be found in our environments, and we quickly come to anticipate and rely on that in our environments. And it of course makes for a very parsimonious means of responding to the environment. But as a result, we can often throw us off our guard.
How do you think that the field should move forward? What are the next steps?
Well, as I say, I think that one of the reasons it's hard to say we have a field of educational neuroscience is, of course, we don't have recognized doctoral degrees in this, and I don't think we will have for quite some time. But I think there needs to be a collective understanding of, obviously, in my essay, I'm arguing here for attending to issues of intellectual coherence, mutually informative and respected expertise, and the moral and ethical obligations we have to protect our work from misappropriation. And I'm sure people will disagree with the arguments that I make, the examples that I give of lapses in this regard in my essay. But as long as they address those issues, I'm happy with that. We need to come to some sort of determination as a group of collaborating colleagues within this emerging field. I think that's where we need to go.
Well, thank you very much, George, for your insights and your very intelligent discussion of these issues. I'd also like to thank the listeners and urge them to read the article in the British Journal of Educational Psychology.